After my wife's dad, the CEO, funeral, my wife became the new CEO, and I didn't bring up the 71% stake I owned in the company. A week later, the board announced, "We've decided to terminate your position. Pack your things immediately." I just smiled, thanked them, and left quietly. Monday would be fun. I stood in the back of St. Alden's Cathedral, wedged between a marble column that probably cost more than most people's cars and a potted fern that looked like it was judging me, pretending to mourn my late father-in-law, Charles Montgomery, founder, former CEO, and the only person in the Montgomery family who actually knew what a balance sheet was. The whole scene felt like a corporate-sponsored production of a Greek tragedy, complete with dramatic organ music that was somehow both too loud and not loud enough to drown out the performative sniffling happening in the front rows. To everyone else in this overpriced mausoleum of fake grief and real Botox, I was just the son-in-law with no real job, the guy who married into money and then had the audacity to not immediately transform into Gordon Gekko. I'd overheard that exact phrase at least a dozen times over the past 3 years, usually whispered by board members who couldn't balance their own checkbooks without calling their accountants in a panic. To me, though, Charles had been both mentor and chess partner, the kind of guy who could explain derivative markets while simultaneously destroying you in 4 moves on the board. We'd spent years, actual years, sitting in his study, laughing at the board's incompetence over expensive scotch, secretly planning for the day the company would need saving from the very idiots who were supposed to be running it. Well, that day had come crashing through the door like the Kool-Aid man on a mission, though no one in this cathedral full of crocodile tears and designer handkerchiefs knew I already owned 71% of Montgomery Industries, courtesy of Charles's last brilliant move. The old man had set up the perfect checkmate, and he wasn't even alive to see it play out. Somewhere in whatever afterlife he'd ended up in, I hoped he had a front row seat and a bucket of popcorn. As my wife, Elena, stood up front in her black designer dress, and I mean designer in the way that suggested she'd confused morning attire with red carpet at the Met Gala, the board members watched her like hyenas eyeing a fresh carcass. Seriously, if they'd been any more obvious about it, they would have started circling and laughing in that weird hyena way. I could practically see the dollar signs spinning in their eyes like slot machine reels. Victor Rothschild, the silver-haired chairman who looked like he'd been born wearing a three-piece suit, kept adjusting his tie and exchanging meaningful glances with the other vultures. Bryce Kellerman, whose personality could best be described as wet cardboard left out in a mild drizzle, was practically salivating, probably already mentally redecorating Charles's corner office. I almost pitied them. Almost. But then I remembered the time Bryce tried to explain to me how synergy was the key to modern business success, and the pity evaporated faster than my patience during corporate retreats. Elena dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than the average person's monthly rent, and I watched as she performed her grief for the assembled crowd of sharks in expensive suits. Don't get me wrong, she'd loved her father in her own way, the same way people love a really good Wi-Fi connection. Convenient, reliable, and panic-inducing when it suddenly disappears. But standing up there, with the stained glass windows casting colorful shadows across her carefully composed face, she looked every inch the grieving heiress ready to take her rightful place at the helm of the family empire. The pastor, some guy named Father Michael who I was pretty sure Charles had never met in his life, droned on about legacy and vision and other buzzwords that sounded deep but meant absolutely nothing. I tuned him out somewhere around the third mention of beloved pillar of the community, and instead focused on mentally cataloging every board member's face. There was Victor, obviously, looking appropriately somber while probably calculating quarterly projections in his head. Bryce, trying to look sad, but mostly managing to look constipated. Margaret Chun, the CFO who actually knew what she was doing, but was too much of a people-pleaser to ever stand up to the boys' club. And Gerald Foster, who I was 90% sure had been asleep for the last 20 minutes, his head bobbing gently to the rhythm of his own snoring. Behind me, I heard someone whisper, "I heard he doesn't even have a real position at the company. Just shows up sometimes and plays around on his computer." I recognized the voice, Stephanie something, from HR, who'd once asked me if I was Elena's personal assistant at a company Christmas party. I'd told her I was more of a professional disappointment, which she'd found hilarious until she realized I wasn't joking. The thing was, they weren't entirely wrong. I didn't have a flashy title or a corner office or business cards that I handed out at networking events like some kind of corporate Pokemon trainer. What I did have was Charles's trust, a degree in business management from Northwestern that I'd actually earned unlike some people I could mention, and a knack for seeing through bullshit that would have made a professional poker player jealous. Charles had recognized that early on, back when I was dating Elena, and everyone assumed I was just another gold digger with better hair. "You're not like the others," he'd told me once, after I'd spent an entire evening pointing out the flaws in the board's latest revolutionary strategy. "You actually give a damn about the company, not just the stock price." He'd taught me everything. The real business, not the sanitized version they taught in MBA programs. The late-night meetings with factory managers, the unglamorous work of actually understanding how things worked, the importance of knowing every employee's name, not just the ones who could help your career. And then, 3 weeks before he died, he pulled me into his study, poured us both 3 fingers of his favorite whiskey, and slid a folder across the desk. "I'm dying," he'd said, as casually as if he was commenting on the weather. "The doctors give me a month, maybe 2. And I'll be damned if I let those parasites tear apart everything I built." The funeral was wrapping up now, with Father Michael inviting everyone to join the family for a reception at the Montgomery estate, which was code for "come watch rich people eat expensive cheese and pretend to be sad." Elena was being helped down from the podium by Victor, who was laying on the concerned act a little too thick for my taste. The board members were already forming clusters, their grief masks slipping to reveal the calculating expressions underneath. I straightened my tie, a simple black one that Elena had criticized for being too plain, and whispered under my breath, just loud enough for the judgmental Fern to hear, "Rest easy, Charles. This circus is about to get interesting." A week later, Elena strutted into her new office, Charles's old office, though nobody was tactless enough to say it out loud. There were line items in here that made absolutely no sense unless you understood that consulting fees was code for Victor's nephew who literally does nothing, and operational restructuring costs meant we're paying ourselves extra for doing the bare minimum. I was 3 reports deep into what appeared to be a creative accounting scheme involving our manufacturing division when my phone buzzed. "Elena, party tonight, 7 p.m., Penthouse Ballroom. Be there." All caps, because apparently we were now communicating like we were stuck in a 2005 text message chain. "No, please. No, would you like to come?" Just a command delivered with all the warmth of a parking ticket. She threw a party that night to celebrate her coronation. Sorry, I mean appointment. And it was exactly the kind of soulless corporate schmoozefest you'd expect. The penthouse ballroom of the Montgomery building had been transformed into what I can only describe as nouveau riche meets desperate for approval, with ice sculptures shaped like the company logo that were already melting under the hot lights and creating little puddles of corporate symbolism on the marble floor. There was a champagne fountain, an actual champagne fountain, like we were at a wedding in 1995, and a string quartet playing classical music that nobody was listening to because everyone was too busy networking their faces off. The same board members who couldn't name a single factory employee if their stock options depended on it were suddenly gathered around Elena, toasting a new era and bold leadership and other meaningless phrases that sounded impressive but were essentially verbal wallpaper. Victor Rothschild was holding court near the bar, his silver hair practically glowing under the chandelier light, explaining to anyone who'd listen how he'd always known Elena had the vision to lead. This was the same guy who'd told Charles 6 months ago that women were too emotional for executive positions, but apparently death and dollar signs had a way of changing perspectives. Margaret Chun from finance was there, looking uncomfortable in a cocktail dress and sensible heels, nursing what looked like a club soda because Margaret never drank at company events, which was probably the only reason she still had her job. Gerald Foster was parked by the buffet table, loading up a plate with shrimp cocktail like he was preparing for the apocalypse. And Bryce. Oh, Bryce was in his element, working the room like a politician at a fundraiser, his handshake-to-conversation ratio hovering at about 5-to-1. I was standing near one of the melting ice sculptures, watching the whole spectacle unfold and wondering if I could sneak out before anyone noticed, when Bryce materialized next to me like a particularly unwelcome magic trick. He was holding a martini glass in one hand and wore the kind of smile that made you want to check if your wallet was still in your pocket. "Lucas," he said, way too loud for how close he was standing, the gin on his breath competing with his cologne in what could only be described as an olfactory assault. "Hell of a night, isn't it? Elena really knocked it out of the park with this one." "It's definitely something," I said, watching as a waiter tried to discreetly mop up champagne fountain spillage with a tablecloth. "Very her." Bryce took a long sip of his martini and then patted my back with the kind of patronizing sympathy usually reserved for golden retrievers who'd failed obedience school. "Tough luck, huh? From CEO's son-in-law to whatever it is you do here." He laughed at his own joke, which was really just mean-spirited observation disguised as humor, and I could see several other board members nearby, trying not to look like they were eavesdropping while absolutely eavesdropping. I smiled, the kind of smile I'd perfected over 3 years of dealing with people like Bryce, the one that said I was in on the joke even though I was the punchline. "Mostly breathing and collecting dividends," I said, keeping my voice casual and light. "It's exhausting, honestly. Sometimes I have to sit down." He laughed again, harder this time, like I'd just delivered the setup and punchline to the world's greatest joke, not realizing he'd just congratulated his boss. Behind him, I could see Victor watching our interaction with the intensity of a hawk eyeing a particularly slow rabbit, probably trying to gauge whether I was going to cause problems or just fade quietly into the wallpaper like a good little trust fund baby. The thing about being underestimated is that it's like having a superpower nobody knows about. While Bryce was busy mentally composing the story he'd tell at the next board meeting about poor Lucas and his little analyst job, I was calculating exactly how long it would take to dismantle his entire career. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if I wanted to be thorough about it. Charles had taught me that patience wasn't just a virtue. It was a weapon, and the best revenge was served so cold it gave people hypothermia. "How's Elena settling in?" I asked, because playing dumb was part of the game, and I'd gotten pretty good at it over the years. "Oh, she's a natural," Bryce gushed, and I wondered if he practiced being this obsequious in the mirror or if it came naturally. "Really gets the big picture, you know? Not getting bogged down in details. That's what we need. Vision, not micromanagement." Translation: she had no idea how to actually run a company, but as long as she signed whatever they put in front of her and looked good doing it, they were happy. The board had wanted a puppet, and in Elena, they'd found one with great hair and an Instagram following. Across the room, Elena was laughing at something Victor said, her hand on his arm in that calculated way she had of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. She caught my eye for just a second, and I raised my glass in a small salute. She smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. It never did anymore. Friday came rolling around like a freight train nobody ordered, and I was called into the boardroom at exactly 9:30 in the morning, which I knew was intentional because nobody at Montgomery Industries did anything at 9:30 unless it was designed to ruin your entire day. The email had come from Victor's assistant, Patricia, a woman who'd mastered the art of passive-aggressive corporate communication to the point where she could make "please" sound like a threat. "Your presence is requested in conference room A," it read, with all the warmth of a restraining order. Conference room A was the big one, the intimidation chamber with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, and a table so long you could land a small aircraft on it. It was where they held the really important meetings, the ones that decided whether subsidiaries lived or died, whether entire departments got axed, whether some poor schmuck in middle management was about to discover that restructuring meant we're replacing you with someone younger and cheaper. I'd only been in there maybe 5 times in 3 years, and each time I'd felt like I was walking into a trap designed by people who'd watched too many corporate thriller movies. The air smelled like burnt ego and cheap coffee. Somehow they'd managed to make the coffee situation even worse in the executive conference rooms, which I didn't think was physically possible, but here we were. 6 board members were already seated around that massive table like they were the Last Supper, except instead of Jesus and his disciples, it was a bunch of middle-aged white guys in suits that cost more than most people's monthly salaries and their token diverse hire, Margaret, who looked like she'd rather be literally anywhere else. Victor sat at the head of the table, naturally, because he'd probably sleep in that chair if his wife would let him. Bryce was to his right, wearing a smile that suggested he'd been practicing in the mirror for the past hour. Gerald Foster was half asleep as usual, which meant he was probably the smartest person in the room because at least he knew this was a waste of time. There were three others whose names I honestly couldn't remember, middle management types who'd been promoted beyond their competence and now spent their days trying to look busy and important. One of them, a guy with a comb-over that defied physics, was frantically taking notes on an iPad even though nobody had said anything yet. The chairman cleared his throat dramatically, like a man who'd rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror multiple times, probably while wearing different ties to see which one made him look most authoritative. Victor Rothschild had always had a flair for the theatrical, which was hilarious considering his actual personality had the depth of a parking lot puddle. "Lucas," he began, and the way he said my name made it sound like he was addressing a particularly disappointing houseplant. "Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm sure you're wondering why we've called you here." I wasn't wondering, actually. I'd known this was coming since Tuesday when I'd overheard Bryce on the phone in the hallway talking about clearing out dead weight and optimizing personnel allocation. But I nodded anyway, playing along with their little theater production. "I have some theories," I said, settling into my chair like I had all the time in the world. "But please, enlighten me." Victor exchanged glances with Bryce, one of those meaningful executive looks that was supposed to convey entire conversations, but really just made them look constipated. "We've been reviewing our organizational structure," he continued, pulling out what appeared to be a prepared statement because God forbid anyone in this room have an original thought. "And in light of recent changes in leadership, we've decided to make some adjustments to better align our resources with our strategic objectives." I had to fight back a laugh. Corporate speak was its own language, a beautiful dialect of meaningless buzzwords strung together in ways that technically formed sentences but communicated absolutely nothing. "Strategic objectives," I repeated like I was testing out the words. "Fascinating. Tell me more." Bryce leaned forward, unable to contain himself any longer, like a kid who couldn't wait to tell you that your dog had died. "What Victor is trying to say is that we've decided to terminate your position, effective immediately." The room went quiet except for the sound of comb-over guy's stylus frantically scratching across his iPad screen. Margaret was staring at her hands like they contained the secrets of the universe. Gerald had actually woken up, probably startled by the sudden tension in the room. I paused, letting the moment hang there, watching as they all waited for my reaction with the anticipation of people watching a reality TV show elimination. "Just like that?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, curious even. "Yes," Victor said, and you could hear the pride in his voice, the satisfaction of a man who thought he'd just solved world hunger instead of firing someone from a meaningless analyst position. He straightened his tie, which was probably Hermes or some other brand that cost more than a decent used car. "We believe this is in the best interest of the company moving forward. You'll receive 2 months severance, of course, and we'll provide a positive reference should you need one for future employment opportunities." 2 months severance. How generous. How magnanimous. I was being fired from a job that barely existed in the first place, and they were acting like they were doing me a favor by throwing me some pocket change on my way out the door. I smiled, and I could see the confusion starting to creep into their expressions because I definitely wasn't reacting the way they'd expected. "Perfect," I said, and meant it. "I was worried you'd make it awkward." Bryce's smile flickered like a faulty light bulb. "I'm sorry. Awkward," I repeated, standing up and straightening my own tie, which was Brooks Brothers and cost a fraction of what theirs did, but somehow made me feel like I was wearing armor. You know, like you'd want to have a whole emotional conversation about it, or I'd have to sit through one of those HR exit interviews where they pretend to care why I'm leaving. This is much cleaner. I appreciate the efficiency. Their grins flickered in unison now, like someone had pressed a universal confusion button. Victor looked at Bryce. Bryce looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at her hands again like they might have developed the ability to teleport her out of this situation. They'd expected begging, panic, maybe tears. The whole firing ritual depended on the fired person playing their role correctly. Shock, denial, anger, bargaining. The whole Kubler-Ross greatest hits album. Instead, I was acting like they'd just told me I'd won the lottery. "You're taking this well," Victor managed, his forehead creasing in that way that suggested his Botox was working overtime. "Why wouldn't I?" I asked, gathering my things with the casualness of someone leaving a coffee shop, not a career. I picked up the pen they'd given me 3 years ago, a Mont Blanc that was supposed to signify my place in the Montgomery family, now just an overpriced writing instrument. It's just business, right? Nothing personal. You guys need to restructure, align resources, optimize whatever. I get it. Companies evolve. People move on. Circle of corporate life, and all that. I walked toward the door, and I swear I could feel the confusion radiating off them like heat waves off asphalt in July. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't the script. We appreciate your understanding, Victor called after me, his voice uncertain now, like he was trying to regain control of a situation that had slipped through his fingers without him noticing. I paused at the door and turned back, giving them my best genuine smile. Gentlemen, it's been educational. Truly. I've learned so much about corporate governance, strategic planning, and the creative limits of expense account fraud. Margaret actually choked on air at that one. I even waved at Marcus, the janitor, on my way out. Salt of the earth guy. Actually knows how to fix things instead of just breaking them. As I reached the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished chrome doors and smirked, watching as the muscles in my face relaxed into something that felt dangerously close to genuine happiness. Behind me, through the conference room's glass walls, I could see them all frozen in various states of bewilderment, probably trying to figure out if I'd just insulted them or complimented them or both. Monday's going to be a riot, I whispered to my reflection as the elevator doors opened. Back home, I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the good stuff, a 23-year-old Pappy Van Winkle that Charles had given me for my 30th birthday with a note that said, "Save it for when you really need it," and opened the safe hidden behind what Elena thought was just a really boring abstract painting in my home office. The painting was boring. Actually, some overpriced monstrosity she'd bought at a charity auction because the artist was emerging and provocative, which as far as I could tell meant he'd figured out how to charge $5,000 for what looked like a toddler's finger painting experiment gone wrong. But behind it was a biometric safe that Charles had helped me install one weekend while Elena was in Milan, doing whatever wealthy women do in Milan, probably spending obscene amounts of money on shoes she'd wear exactly once. Inside the safe, nestled between my passport, some emergency cash, and the deed to a lake house in Wisconsin that I'd bought under an LLC because sometimes a guy just needs to disappear for a weekend without his location showing up on Find My Friends, lay the document that was about to turn Montgomery Industries completely upside down. The notarized transfer of 71% controlling shares in Montgomery Industries, signed by Charles Montgomery himself 3 weeks before he died, witnessed by his personal attorney, my lawyer Maya Chun, and a notary public named Gladys who ran a small office in Naperville and had no idea she was witnessing the corporate equivalent of a nuclear bomb being armed. I pulled out the document carefully, like it was the Declaration of Independence or the last slice of pizza at a party, and sat down at my desk. The paper was heavy, that expensive kind that practically screamed important legal document just by existing. Charles's signature was there at the bottom, strong and confident even though his hands had been shaking from the chemo by that point. Next to it was my signature, and below that, all the legal language that basically translated to Lucas Ward now owns this entire circus and everyone in it. The conversation when we'd signed it had been surreal, the kind of moment that felt more like a movie scene than real life. Charles had been sitting in his study, the one with the leather chairs that smelled like old books and expensive Sagak, looking thinner than I'd ever seen him, but still sharp as a tack. He'd poured us both whiskey, though his doctor had explicitly told him not to, and slid the folder across his desk. Never tell Elena, he had warned me, his voice raspy from the treatments but firm. She'll turn it into a social media caption. I can see it now, CEO Life chose me, with some inspirational quote about legacy and 20 hashtags. He'd mimicked typing on a phone, and despite everything, we both laughed. She's my daughter, and I love her, but Lucas, she doesn't understand what it takes to actually run a company. She understands optics, branding, image. She thinks business is a photo shoot. He wasn't wrong. Elena had already started planning her CEO aesthetic Pinterest board before Charles was even in the ground. I'd seen it one night when she left her laptop open, pages and pages of power suits, minimalist office designs, and motivational quotes in pretentious fonts. The future is female, next to disrupt or die, next to boss babe energy. It was like someone had thrown every corporate empowerment cliché into a blender and hit frappe. I took a long sip of the whiskey, letting it burn its way down my throat in that pleasant way that expensive alcohol does, and pulled out my phone. Maya Chin's number was at the top of my favorites list, right above the pizza place that delivered until 2 a.m. and the guy who fixed my espresso machine. I texted her a photo of the document with a simple message. They fired me today. How's our position? The three little dots appeared almost immediately. Maya didn't sleep much, which was either a commentary on her dedication to her clients or a serious caffeine addiction, possibly both. Her response came through less than 30 seconds later. It's legally binding. Ironclad. I've had 3 separate firms review it. Sit tight and let them dig their own graves. Also, congrats on the termination. That's actually hilarious timing. I smiled at my phone like an idiot. Maya Chun was a bulldog in Louboutins, a Harvard law grad who'd chosen corporate litigation because, in her words, criminal law is too emotional, and I prefer my revenge served in billable hours. Charles had introduced us 2 years ago at a charity function where she'd spent 20 minutes explaining to a hedge fund manager exactly why his latest scheme was going to land him in federal prison. The hedge fund manager had looked terrified. I'd been impressed. We'd been friends ever since. The kind of friendship built on mutual respect, shared cynicism, and an appreciation for people who were actually good at their jobs. So I did exactly what Maya suggested. I sat tight and watched from the sidelines as the board popped champagne, reshuffle management positions like they were playing musical chairs at a particularly cutthroat birthday party, and spread rumors that I was emotionally unstable to anyone who'd listen. Honestly, if emotional instability were an Olympic sport, they'd all be bringing home gold medals and doing endorsement deals for anti-anxiety medication. The rumors started circulating by Monday afternoon. I heard about them from Dave, the security guard in the lobby who'd always been friendly because I actually learned his name and asked about his kids. "Hey, Mr. Ward," he'd said when I came by to clean out my desk. Well, the desk that had been mine, which contained exactly 3 things: a stress ball shaped like a brain that Charles had given me as a joke, a coffee mug that said, "World's okayest employee," and a framed photo of Elena and me from our wedding that felt like it was from another lifetime. Sorry about the job. But hey, between you and me, don't listen to what they're saying up there. Some people are saying you had a breakdown or something, which is bull. I've seen you every day for 3 years. You're the most normal person in this building. I'd thanked Dave and slipped him $100 bill, which he'd tried to refuse before I insisted. For being one of the good ones, I told him. And Dave, in about a week, things are going to get really interesting around here. Just keep your head down and don't believe everything you hear. By Wednesday, the rumor mill had evolved from emotionally unstable to full-on creative fiction. According to the break room gossip chain, which I was still getting updates on from a few friendly faces in accounting, I'd apparently had a screaming match with Elena, didn't happen, thrown a laptop at Bryce, tempting but no, been caught day drinking in my office, the coffee was bad but not that bad, and was possibly joining a competitor out of spite, if only they knew. My personal favorite was the rumor that I'd been having an affair with someone from HR, which was both completely false and weirdly specific. HR Linda? Really? The woman was married with 3 kids and spent her lunch breaks doing CrossFit. Not exactly affair material. And also, I wasn't a complete scumbag. Elena called me exactly once during all of this, on Thursday evening. "People are talking," she said without preamble, her voice tight with the kind of stress that comes from caring way too much about what people think. "People are always talking," I replied, watching the sun set over Lake Michigan from my apartment's balcony. "It's kind of their thing. They're saying you're unstable, that the firing was justified. Lucas, you're making me look bad." I almost laughed. Making her look bad. Like I was the one who'd orchestrated this whole thing. Like I'd fired myself just to be inconvenient. "Elena, I got fired from a job that barely existed. If that makes you look bad, maybe the problem isn't me." She'd hung up without saying goodbye, which had become her signature move lately. Saturday morning arrived like a gift from the universe, wrapped in silence and tied with a bow made of absolutely zero corporate bullshit. I woke up at 9 a.m. on a Saturday, which felt positively decadent after years of Elena's 7 a.m. sunrise yoga and networking brunch routine. Made myself a proper cup of coffee using beans I'd ground myself like some kind of caffeinated caveman discovering fire, and realized that for the first time in 3 years, I had absolutely nothing I was supposed to be doing. No charity galas where I had to smile at people whose names I'd forget in 5 minutes. No board member dinner parties where the conversation oscillated between bragging about vacation homes and complaining about capital gains taxes. No corporate events where I had to pretend that trust falls and personality assessments were somehow building a cohesive team dynamic. It was peaceful in the way that the eye of a hurricane is peaceful, calm, quiet, and completely aware that absolute chaos was swirling just outside the bubble. I spent the afternoon doing gloriously normal things that wealthy people's husbands apparently weren't supposed to do. I grilled steaks on my balcony, proper ribeyes that I'd picked up from a butcher shop in Wicker Park run by a guy named Tommy who had opinions about marbling that bordered on religious fervor. I watched Formula One, specifically the Japanese Grand Prix, and actually got invested in the drama of tire strategies and DRS zones, which Elena had once described as watching cars go in circles for 2 hours, completely missing the point. I ignored every single message from Elena's PR team, a group of 20-somethings with communications degrees and main character syndrome who kept texting me to stay classy online and refrain from social media commentary during this transitional period. Transitional period. Like I was going through puberty instead of getting fired from a fake job by a board of directors who couldn't find their own asses with both hands and a GPS. The PR team had been sending me messages since Friday afternoon, each one more desperate than the last. Lucas, we need to control the narrative. Lucas, please confirm you won't be posting anything inflammatory. Lucas, TMZ has been asking questions. The last one had made me laugh out loud. TMZ, like my termination from Montgomery Industries was going to make the news somewhere between celebrity breakups and restaurant health code violations. Although knowing Elena, she'd probably tip them off herself, anything to keep the Montgomery name trending. I'd responded to exactly one message, late Friday night after my third whiskey. I promised not to post shirtless mirror selfies with captions about my ex-employer. That's literally the best I can offer. They hadn't found it funny. Meanwhile, Maya kept me updated throughout the weekend with texts that ranged from informative to absolutely hilarious. Saturday afternoon, around 3, board meeting minutes just leaked to me. They're already planning to sell 2 subsidiaries. Classic greed move. They're calling it strategic divestment to maximize shareholder value. I'd been flipping a steak when that message came through, and I'd actually laughed hard enough that my neighbor on the next balcony over, a grad student named Josh who was perpetually stressed about his dissertation, looked over with concern. "You good, man?" he'd called out. "Never better," I'd replied, raising my beer in salute. Just watching some people make really bad decisions from a safe distance. I texted Maya back, "Perfect. Let them hang themselves with paperwork." "Which subsidiaries?" Her response was immediate. Anderson Manufacturing and the tech startup they acquired last year. You know, the ones that are actually profitable and have growth potential. They're selling the good stuff to juice the quarterly numbers. It was so predictable it almost hurt. The board was doing exactly what short-sighted executives always did, sacrificing long-term stability for short-term gains that would make their stock options look good before they inevitably jumped ship to another company where they could repeat the same playbook. Charles had seen it coming, which is exactly why he'd made his move. The man had understood that Montgomery Industries needed protection from the very people who were supposed to be protecting it. Sunday was even better. I slept in until 10, made waffles from scratch because I could, and because the smell would annoy Elena if she decided to show up unannounced she didn't. And spent most of the afternoon reading financial reports that Maya had sent over. The board's plans were laid out in excruciating detail, all in that special corporate language that made "we're screwing everyone for personal profit" sound like innovative restructuring initiatives designed to enhance operational efficiency. They were planning to sell Anderson Manufacturing to a private equity firm for substantially less than it was worth, probably because someone on the board had a connection there and was expecting a kickback. The tech startup, a company called NeuralSync that was actually developing some genuinely interesting AI applications for manufacturing automation, was being shopped around to competitors. It was like watching someone sell off pieces of a classic car for scrap metal prices because they couldn't be bothered to understand what they actually had. I was 3 reports deep into their idiocy, making notes in the margins like I was grading term papers from students who hadn't bothered to study, when Maya texted again. They're moving fast, trying to close both deals before end of quarter, which is in 3 weeks. Of course they are, I typed back. Can't let things like due diligence or fiduciary responsibility slow them down. You sound like you're enjoying this. Maya, I'm having the time of my life. This is better than Netflix. By Sunday night, I was on my couch, working through a particularly creative accounting scheme they'd cooked up to hide some of their more questionable expenses when my phone rang. Bryce Kellerman. I stared at his name on my screen for a solid 10 seconds, debating whether answering would be worth the entertainment value. Curiosity won. Bryce, I answered, putting him on speaker so I could continue reading. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? Lucas. Hey, buddy. His voice had that forced cheerfulness of someone who was either drunk or about to ask for something. Possibly both. How's the weekend treating you? Getting some rest after, everything? Oh, I said casually, flipping to the next page of board minutes. Just processing my emotions, contemplating my life choices, the usual post-termination activities. Also made waffles. They were excellent. There was a pause, like he was trying to figure out if I was being sarcastic. I was. I was always being sarcastic. That's great, man. Really great. Listen, I was actually calling because, well, tough week, huh? The whole termination thing. That must have been rough. I could hear the smile in his voice, that particular tone of fake sympathy that people use when they're actually delighted about your misfortune but have to pretend otherwise for social convention reasons. It was the vocal equivalent of saying, "bless your heart," in the South. Technically polite, actually condescending. Devastating, I replied, deadpan. I've been crying into my premium whiskey and expensive steaks all weekend. It's been very difficult. Right. Well, I just wanted you to know, and this is totally off the record, friend to friend. If you're ever looking for a job, I know a guy at a small firm downtown. They're always looking for talented people, and I'm sure I could put in a good word for you. Help you land on your feet. I had to physically bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Bryce was offering me a job at a small firm, downtown, like he was doing me some enormous favor, like he was throwing a life preserver to a drowning man. The condescension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. That's kind, I said, and I meant it to sound sincere, but it definitely came out amused. Does he need someone to buy him out by Monday? Silence. Complete, beautiful silence. I'm sorry, what? The firm, I clarified, thoroughly enjoying myself now. Is he looking for an acquisition? Because I've got some capital freed up, and I'm always interested in investment opportunities. Small firms downtown can be real hidden gems if they're managed right. More silence. I could practically hear the gears turning in Bryce's head, grinding against each other like a transmission that was about to fail catastrophically. I think you might have misunderstood, he finally managed. I meant like an analyst position. Entry-level stuff. Something to get you back in the game. Oh, I understood perfectly, I said, still smiling. I just thought if we're talking about downtown firms, we might as well think big. But hey, if he needs an analyst, tell him to send me his info. I'm always happy to review opportunities. He didn't get the joke. Of course he didn't. Bryce Kellerman had never gotten a joke in his entire life unless it was explained to him in PowerPoint format, with supporting documentation. I put on my best Navy suit Monday morning. The one Elena once said made me look like a well-paid accountant, which at the time I'd taken as an insult, but now realized was actually perfect for what I was about to do. Accountants were underestimated, overlooked, the kind of people who quietly kept track of where all the bodies were buried, while everyone else was busy taking credit for things they didn't do. I paired it with a crisp white shirt, a burgundy tie that Charles had given me 2 Christmases ago, and cufflinks that had belonged to his father. Call it superstition, call it sentimentality, but I wanted him there with me in spirit when I walked into that boardroom and burned the whole thing down. The Montgomery building looked the same as it always did on a Monday morning. Glass and steel reaching up into the Chicago sky, like a middle finger to good taste and reasonable architecture, with the company logo emblazoned on the side in letters big enough to be seen from space. The lobby was packed with the usual Monday morning crowd. Junior executives trying to look important while clutching their Starbucks like security blankets, administrative assistants who actually ran everything while their bosses took credit, Maintenance workers who kept the building functioning while being completely invisible to everyone above the third floor. Security at the building stopped me before I even made it to the elevators, which was new and also completely expected. Dave, my buddy from the front desk, wasn't there. Instead, it was Marcus, the weekend guy who looked like he'd played linebacker in college and now took his job of standing intimidatingly very seriously. The escort turned out to be Janet from HR, the same Janet who'd processed my termination paperwork on Friday with the emotional investment of someone filing a TPS report. She looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, including possibly on fire, as she led me to the elevator bank. We rode up in silence, her clutching her tablet like a shield, me humming the theme song from The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly, because if you're going to have a showdown, you might as well have the right soundtrack. "This is highly irregular," Janet finally said as we approached the 32nd floor, which housed the executive offices and the main boardroom. "Janet, I appreciate that," I said sincerely. "I know this isn't in your job description. For what it's worth, you've always been professional, and I respect that." She glanced at me, surprised. Are you about to do something crazy?" "Define crazy," I said as the elevator doors opened. "Because from where I'm standing, what's crazy is a board of directors selling off profitable subsidiaries to pad their own portfolios. What's crazy is firing someone and then being shocked when there are consequences. I'm just here to have a conversation." Minutes later, I walked into the boardroom, and the reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for. Every single face froze in that special way that faces do when the person you definitely weren't expecting shows up to the party. Bryce, who'd been mid-sip of his coffee, nearly choked on it, sputtering like an old lawn mower trying to start. Victor's expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and what I can only describe as the beginning stages of understanding that something had gone very, very wrong with his Monday morning plans. "Morning, gentlemen," I said cheerfully, setting my briefcase down on the table with a solid thunk that echoed in the suddenly silent room. "And Margaret, of course. Sorry, didn't mean to be exclusive there. Beautiful morning, isn't it? I actually saw a cardinal on my way in. They say that's good luck." The chairman, Victor, in all his silver-haired, perfectly pressed suit glory, squinted at me like I was a mirage that might disappear if he blinked hard enough. "You don't work here anymore," he said slowly, like he was explaining basic arithmetic to a particularly dim child. "True," I replied, pulling out a chair at the table. Not just any chair, but the one directly across from Victor, the power position that let me make eye contact with everyone. "Very true, Victor. You fired me on Friday. I remember it clearly. It was quite the production. Very dramatic. Although between you and me, Gerald falling asleep halfway through kind of undercut the gravitas you were going for." Gerald, who had indeed been dozing in his chair, jerked awake at the sound of his name. "What? I wasn't. But here's the thing," I continued, ignoring Gerald's protestations and opening my briefcase with the kind of casual confidence that comes from holding all the cards in a poker game where everyone else thought they were playing Go Fish. "While I don't work here anymore, I own here. And that makes meetings complicated." I dropped the folder on the table, right in the center, where everyone could see it. The sound of paper hitting polished would seem louder than it should have been. The folder was clearly labeled in Maya's precise handwriting. "Transfer of controlling interest, Montgomery Industries Incorporated." Bryce reached for it first, his hand shaking slightly, which I found deeply satisfying. He opened it, and I watched his face go through the same journey that Buzz Aldrin's probably did when he realized he was going to be the second guy on the moon. Initial confidence, growing concern, dawning horror, complete devastation. "This can't be real," he whispered, but his voice cracked on real in a way that suggested he knew it absolutely was. "You expect us to believe," he started, his voice climbing in pitch with each word until he sounded like he was auditioning for a role in a high school production of A Few Good Men, "that Charles Montgomery, the Charles Montgomery, founder of this company, would hand over controlling interest to you? To his son-in-law who doesn't even have a real job? To someone who couldn't even hold down a basic analyst position?" I had to give him credit for the commitment, if not the logic. Bryce had always been the kind of guy who doubled down when he was wrong, like those people who get pulled over for speeding and then argue with the cop about whether their speedometer was accurate. It never worked, but damn if they didn't try every single time. "First of all, I said, holding up one finger like a professor making a point. You fired me, so the whole couldn't hold down narrative is a bit revisionist. Second, believe whatever helps you sleep at night, Bryce. I genuinely don't care. I don't need faith. I have documents. Mountains of them. Notarized, witnessed, reviewed by multiple legal teams, and filed with the SEC. You know what's great about legal documents? They don't care about your feelings. Victor had finally found his voice, though it came out strangled, like someone was standing on his throat. This could destabilize the entire company. Our shareholders, our investors, the market confidence. No, gentlemen, I interrupted, and I couldn't keep the grin off my face because this was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment Charles and I had planned for during those late nights in his study when we'd mapped out every possible response, every objection, every desperate play they might make. You already did that. You've been doing that for years. I'm here to fix it. Think of me as a very polite hurricane. Margaret actually snorted at that, quickly covering it with a cough, when Victor shot her a death glare that could have melted steel. I made a mental note to keep Margaret around. Anyone who could find humor in a corporate apocalypse was someone worth having on your team. A hurricane? Victor repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. You're comparing yourself to a natural disaster? Well, I was going to go with controlled burn or surgical strike, but hurricane felt more accurate given the circumstances, I said, leaning back in my chair. Besides, hurricanes are natural phenomena that clear out rot and decay. Seems appropriate. The door to the boardroom opened suddenly, and Patricia, Victor's assistant, the same woman who'd sent me the original termination meeting invitation, stuck her head in looking absolutely terrified. I'm so sorry to interrupt, Mr. Rothschild, but there's been a situation with... My phone buzzed loudly on the table, cutting her off. I glanced at the screen and felt my grin widen. Anderson Holdings. Perfect timing. The universe really did have a sense of humor. Actually, Patricia, don't worry about it, I said, picking up my phone. I think this might be related to your situation. I answered the call and deliberately put it on speaker, setting the phone down in the middle of the table where everyone could hear. Lucas Ward speaking. Mr. Ward, this is Victoria Hale from Anderson Holdings. Her voice came through crystal clear, all business and sharp edges. Victoria Hale was a legend in the investment world, the kind of woman who could smell bullshit from 3 states away and had made her fortune by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone else in the room. Charles had respected the hell out of her, which was saying something. I'm calling regarding the news about Montgomery Industries' ownership structure. We need to schedule a meeting. Today, if possible. I could see Victor's face losing color, draining from angry red to a pale gray that made him look like he was about to pass out or throw up, or possibly both. Anderson Holdings owned about 18% of Montgomery Industries' remaining shares, not controlling interest, but enough to matter, enough to make or break any major decision the board wanted to make. Of course, Ms. Hale, I said, keeping my voice professional, but making absolutely sure everyone in the room could hear every word. I'm actually in a board meeting right now, discussing the transition. How does 2 o'clock work for you? I can meet at your offices, or we can do a video call if that's more convenient. 2 o'clock is perfect. My offices. And Mr. Ward? Bring your attorney and your CFO. We have a lot to discuss regarding the current board's recent decisions. Absolutely. I'll have Maya Chun with me. She's my attorney, and I'll bring Margaret Chun as well, assuming she's willing to step into the CFO role officially. I glanced at Margaret, who looked like someone had just told her she'd won the lottery and been drafted into the army simultaneously. We'll see you at 2. Excellent. I look forward to working with leadership that actually understands fiduciary responsibility. The line went dead, but that last comment hung in the air like a grenade that had just had its pin pulled. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop, or in this case, you could hear Bryce's soul leaving his body through his mouth, which hung open like a broken mailbox. Did she just, one of the nameless board members started, imply that you've been failing at your basic legal obligations to the shareholders? I finished helpfully. Yeah, she did. Victoria is not really known for subtlety, one of her many charms. Bryce looked like someone had just told him that Santa Claus wasn't real, the Easter Bunny was a lie, and his childhood dog had actually been sent to a farm where they turned dogs into hot dogs. His entire worldview was crumbling in real time, and I was here for every second of it. This is insane, he whispered, but there was no fight left in his voice. It was the sound of a man realizing that the game was over and he'd lost spectacularly. You can't walk in here and take over the company that I legally own 71% of, I suggested. I think you'll find I can, actually. It's kind of what majority shareholders do. It's in the job description, right between attend meetings and fire incompetent board members. Gerald, who'd been silent this whole time, suddenly piped up from his corner. I think I'm going to retire, he announced to no one in particular. My wife's been wanting to travel. See Italy. Maybe learn to paint. This seems like a good time. Gerald, you can't just, Victor started. I absolutely can, Gerald interrupted, standing up with more energy than I'd seen from him in 3 years. I'm 72 years old. I've got more money than I can spend, and I don't need this stress. Lucas, it's been interesting. Good luck with this mess. Victoria Hale doesn't suffer fools, so clean house before that meeting. He nodded at me respectfully and walked out, leaving his portfolio and his coffee mug behind like artifacts from a previous civilization. The remaining board members looked at each other, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. They'd fired the majority shareholder, sold off valuable assets without his approval, and now the company's largest external investor wanted a meeting to discuss their recent decisions, which was corporate speak for explain why you're all idiots before we pull our money. Gentlemen, I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket, I think we all need to take a breath and reconvene. I have a meeting at 2, which gives us about 4 hours to figure out how we're going to explain to Victoria Hale why you were trying to sell Anderson Manufacturing, which, by the way, is named after her grandfather, to a private equity firm for 30% below market value. Margaret, can you pull together all the financial data on that proposed sale? I want to see every number. Margaret nodded, already pulling out her laptop. I'll have it ready within the hour. For what it's worth, I voted against that sale. It's in the minutes. I know, I said, giving her a genuine smile. I read them. That's why you still have a job. Bryce finally found his voice again, though it came out weak and defeated. You're really going to do this? Just take over. Bryce, I said, pausing at the door and turning back to face him. I already did. At 2 o'clock sharp, I walked into Victoria Hale's offices on the 47th floor of the Willis Tower, and yes, I still called it the Sears Tower in my head like every other actual Chicagoan, because some things were sacred and corporate rebranding could go to hell. Flanked by Maya Chun, who looked like she was dressed for war in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than a decent used car, and Margaret, who'd spent the past 3 hours pulling together financial reports and looked like she'd mainlined an entire pot of coffee directly into her veins. Victoria's office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd made her first billion by age 35. Floor-to-ceiling windows with a view that made you feel like you were floating above the city. Furniture that was simultaneously minimalist and obscenely expensive, and absolutely zero personal touches that might suggest she had a life outside of making money and destroying the careers of people who wasted her time. There was a single photograph on her desk, black and white, of an older man who I assumed was the grandfather she'd mentioned, the one who'd founded Anderson Manufacturing back when manufacturing actually meant something in America. Victoria herself was standing by the window when we entered, silhouetted against the Chicago skyline like some kind of corporate superhero, which honestly wasn't far from the truth. She turned as we walked in, and I was reminded why Charles had always said that meeting Victoria Hale was like meeting a very polite shark, elegant, professional, and absolutely capable of tearing you apart if you gave her a reason. Mr. Ward, she said, extending her hand with a grip that was firm without being aggressive, the handshake of someone who'd perfected the art of professional intimidation. Ms. Chun. She nodded at both Maya and Margaret, her expression neutral but assessing, like she was running calculations in her head about everyone's net worth and potential usefulness. Please sit. We settled into leather chairs that were probably more comfortable than my bed, arranged around a glass conference table that was so clean I could see my reflection in it. Victoria sat across from us, folding her hands on the table in a way that suggested this was going to be a very serious conversation and small talk wasn't on the agenda. We don't support chaos, she said bluntly, getting straight to the point in a way I deeply appreciated after years of corporate meetings that could have been emails. Anderson Holdings has 18% of Montgomery Industries, which makes us your largest external investor. When Charles was alive, we had confidence in the company's direction. When Elena took over last week, we had concerns. Now you're telling me that you've been the majority shareholder this entire time, and frankly, Mr. Ward, I need to understand what that means for our investment. Good, I replied, matching her directness because playing games with Victoria Hale was like playing chess against a supercomputer. You were going to lose, so you might as well lose honestly. I only cause chaos when it's necessary. And right now, it's very necessary. The board has been running Montgomery Industries like a personal ATM for years, and they were about to sell your grandfather's company to a private equity vulture for pennies on the dollar. Victoria was watching me carefully, probably trying to determine whether I was another corporate parasite or someone who actually gave a damn about fixing the problems. Here's what I want to do, I said, pulling out the folder Margaret had prepared. Cost freezes on all executive compensation until we stabilize operations. Full audit of every department to identify where we're hemorrhaging money and talent. Leadership cleanup. Anyone on the board who can't justify their position gets voted out at the next shareholder meeting. And investor transparency, which means you get monthly reports on everything, not the sanitized bullshit Victor's been feeding you. Victoria's expression didn't change, but she took the folder and started reading through it with the speed and focus of someone who actually understood what she was looking at. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the sound of pages turning and the distant hum of the city 47 floors below us. My phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. I glanced at it discreetly and saw Maya's personal number, not her office line, her personal cell, which she only used for emergencies or really good gossip. I excused myself quietly and checked the message. They're trying to claim Charles was mentally unfit when he signed. Victor's hired some hotshot firm to challenge the share transfer. They're filing in court tomorrow morning. I almost laughed out loud. Of course they were. Of course the board's response to losing wasn't to accept defeat gracefully, but to burn everything down and salt the earth on their way out. It was so predictable it was almost boring. I typed back quickly, send them a copy of his medical clearance from 3 weeks before he signed. And Maya? Include a Sudoku puzzle. Tell them Charles completed it the same day he signed the transfer, expert level, in under 8 minutes. For irony, Maya's response was immediate. You're my favorite client. I'm billing them for the puzzle. Victoria looked up from the folder, catching my smile. Good news. The opposite, actually, I said, sliding my phone back into my pocket. The board is trying to challenge the share transfer by claiming Charles wasn't mentally competent when he signed it. They're filing in court tomorrow. I expected concern, maybe alarm. Instead, Victoria smiled. A real smile, not the professional one, but something almost predatory. If your shares stand, we'll back you. Full support. 18% voting with your 71. If they manage to overturn the transfer, we're pulling our entire investment within 90 days and shorting your stock on the way out. I want competent leadership, Mr. Ward. I don't particularly care who provides it, but I won't watch my grandfather's legacy get pillaged by idiots. That's fair, I said, appreciating her brutal honesty. You'll have my answer tomorrow after the court hearing. One way or another, this gets resolved fast. We talked strategy for another hour, specific cuts, potential hires, timeline for the audit, communication plans for employees and other investors. Victoria was sharp, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of issues and pointing out problems I hadn't even considered yet. By the time we wrapped up, I had a headache, 17 pages of notes, and a grudging respect for someone who could make me feel simultaneously incompetent and motivated. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made you feel alive, which was ironic considering I was about to spend my morning in a courthouse watching desperate men try to rewrite history. The Circuit Court of Cook County wasn't exactly anyone's idea of a fun Tuesday activity. It was all institutional beige walls, uncomfortable wooden benches, and the faint smell of stress and defeated dreams that seemed to permeate every courthouse I'd ever been in. Victor was there, naturally, sitting in the front row next to a man who could only be Richard Thornton based on the fact that he looked exactly like Central Casting's idea of an expensive lawyer. Silver temples, three-piece suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and an air of superiority that suggested he thought Judge Judy was lowbrow entertainment. Bryce was there too, looking like he hadn't slept well, which gave me a petty sense of satisfaction. Margaret had positioned herself on our side of the aisle, which was interesting and suggested she'd already made her choice about whose team she was on. Two other board members I vaguely recognized were huddled in the back, probably trying to figure out how far away they could distance themselves from this disaster if things went south. The bailiff called us to order, and Judge Patricia Morrison entered from her chambers. She was maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and reading glasses perched on her nose that she looked over rather than through, which gave her a perpetual expression of being deeply unimpressed with everyone's bullshit. I liked her immediately. "This is case number 2025, CV 47362. The bailiff announced in that particular monotone that bailiffs seemed to universally possess. Victor Rothschild and the Board of Directors of Montgomery Industries versus Lucas Ward, regarding the validity of share transfer agreements dated October 1st, 2025. Judge Morrison shuffled some papers on her bench, glanced at both legal teams, and sighed like she'd already decided this was going to be a waste of her morning. "Mr. Thornton, you're filing the challenge. Make it quick." Richard Thornton stood up with the kind of theatrical flourish that suggested he'd practiced this movement in front of a mirror, possibly multiple times. "Your Honor, we are here today because a grave injustice has occurred. Charles Montgomery, beloved founder of Montgomery Industries, was manipulated in his final days by his son-in-law, Mr. Lucas Ward, into signing away controlling interest in a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Mr. Montgomery was undergoing intensive chemotherapy, was on significant pain medication, and was not in any condition to make sound business decisions of this magnitude. Maya didn't even wait for the judge to call on her before standing up. "Your Honor, if I may." "Please do, Ms. Chun. Save me some time here." "Everything Mr. Thornton just said is demonstrably false and frankly insulting to Mr. Montgomery's memory," Maya said, and her voice had that particular edge that suggested she was about to make someone's day significantly worse. "We have medical clearance from Mr. Montgomery's oncologist, Dr. Sarah Patel, at Northwestern Memorial, dated the same day as the signing, confirming that he was of sound mind and not under the influence of any medications that would impair his judgment. We have testimony from the notary public, Gladys Henderson, who spoke with Mr. Montgomery at length and found him to be completely lucid and coherent. We have the testimony of his personal attorney, who was present for the signing and confirmed that Mr. Montgomery understood exactly what he was doing." And she paused for dramatic effect, pulling out a piece of paper with a flourish that matched Thornton's earlier theatrics. "We have a completed expert-level Sudoku puzzle that Mr. Montgomery finished the same day, in under 8 minutes, with perfect accuracy." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing at the expressions on the other side of the courtroom. Thornton looked like someone had just told him his law degree was being recalled. Victor's face went through approximately 7 different shades of red in rapid succession. Bryce just stared at the Sudoku puzzle like it was written in ancient Sumerian. "A Sudoku puzzle," Judge Morrison repeated, and I could hear the amusement in her voice even though her expression remained professionally neutral. "Ms. Chun, are you seriously submitting a Sudoku puzzle as evidence of mental competency?" "Your Honor, I'm submitting it as supplementary evidence along with the medical documentation, legal testimony, and notarized statements." But yes, a man who can complete an expert-level Sudoku puzzle in under 8 minutes is clearly capable of understanding a share transfer agreement. If Mr. Thornton would like to attempt the same puzzle under similar conditions to prove it's not indicative of mental acuity, I'm happy to provide one. Several people in the courtroom gallery actually laughed at that, including the court reporter, who tried to cover it with a cough. Judge Morrison's lips twitched, fighting a smile. Thornton adjusted his glasses, and there it was, Maya's tell, right on schedule, and tried to recover. "Your Honor, the timing is suspicious. Mr. Montgomery dies, and suddenly his son-in-law, who held no significant position in the company, owns 71% of it? This has all the hallmarks of undue influence and manipulation. The timing is suspicious because Mr. Montgomery knew he was dying and wanted to protect his company from exactly what's happening right now," Maya countered smoothly. "He watched his board of directors run Montgomery Industries like a personal piggy bank for years. He watched them prioritize short-term gains over long-term stability. He made a calculated decision to transfer controlling interest to someone he trusted, someone who actually understood the business, someone who wasn't going to sell off profitable divisions to pad quarterly reports. That's not manipulation, Your Honor. That's good business sense and foresight. Judge Morrison held up her hand, silencing both attorneys. I've reviewed the documentation submitted by both parties. Mr. By 11 o'clock Tuesday morning, I reconvened the board in the same conference room where they'd fired me exactly 4 days earlier. Except this time the power dynamic had shifted so dramatically that you could practically feel the air pressure change. I walked in and sat down at the head of the table, Charles's old seat, the one Victor had been warming for exactly 1 week and had probably already ordered new cushions for, and watched as every board member filed in looking like they were attending their own funeral. Margaret looked relieved. Gerald was conspicuously absent, having already submitted his retirement paperwork via email with a subject line that just said, "I'm out." And the rest of them looked like someone had just explained cryptocurrency to them using only interpretive dance. "Bryce," I said, keeping my voice friendly and conversational, like we were discussing weekend plans instead of his imminent career implosion. "Your resignation is effective immediately. Don't forget your mug." I gestured to the world's best executive mug sitting in front of his usual seat, the one he'd bought for himself because apparently nobody else was going to give him that award. He opened his mouth, probably to protest or threaten or maybe just to catch flies, then closed it again. Opened it. Closed it. The man looked like a fish that had just realized it was no longer in water and didn't have any good options. Finally, he just stood up, grabbed his mug, and walked out of the boardroom with whatever dignity he could scrape together, which wasn't much. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than if he'd slammed it. Silence. Sweet, golden, absolutely beautiful silence filled the room like honey, thick and satisfying. Victor was staring at his hands like they might contain the answers to how his perfect plan had gone so catastrophically wrong. The other board members, I really needed to learn their names at some point. Or maybe I didn't, since half of them wouldn't be here next month, were studying the table, the ceiling, their phones, anywhere but at me. "Okay," I said, pulling out the folder Margaret had prepared. "Let's talk about how we're going to fix this mess. First item, the Anderson manufacturing sale is canceled, effective immediately. Margaret, draft the letter to the PE firm. Keep it professional, but make it clear we're not interested now or ever. Second, the Neural Sync sale is also canceled. That company is actually innovative and useful, unlike some of the people in this room. Third, we're conducting a full operational audit of every department. Margaret's leading it, and she has my full authority to fire anyone who can't justify their position or their budget. That's going to take months." One of the nameless board members protested weakly. "Then we better get started," I replied cheerfully. "Oh, and all executive bonuses are frozen until we stabilize operations and employee retention. I know that's going to be tough for some of you, but I'm sure you'll manage to survive on your 6-figure base salaries. Try cutting back on the golf club memberships if money gets tight." By afternoon, the press had picked up the story, and it spread through financial news sites like wildfire in a drought. "Fired executive revealed as 71% owner of Montgomery Industries" was the headline on Bloomberg. The Wall Street Journal went with "corporate coup," how Charles Montgomery's son-in-law took control from beyond the grave, which was a bit dramatic but not inaccurate. CNBC brought me on for a remote interview at 3 o'clock, and the anchor, a woman named Stephanie Chun who had a reputation for not suffering fools, asked me point blank, "Mr. Ward, your critics are saying this was a manipulation of a dying man. How do you respond?" I'd say my critics should read the medical documentation and the court ruling before making accusations they can't back up. I replied, sitting in the temporary office they'd set up for me while Charles's old space was being cleared out. Charles Montgomery was one of the smartest businessmen I've ever known, and he made a calculated decision to protect the company he built. If people want to call that manipulation, they're welcome to their opinion, but the law disagrees. And firing board members on your first day as acknowledged majority shareholder? Technically my 5th day, but who's counting? Look, Bryce Kellerman was trying to sell profitable divisions for personal gain. That's not management, that's looting. I'm not here to play nice with people who treat Montgomery Industries like an ATM machine. The interview went viral. By 5 o'clock, I had 3 voicemails from other news outlets, 2 interview requests from business podcasts, and one very interesting offer from a producer at 60 Minutes who wanted to do a segment on corporate succession in family businesses. I forwarded them all to our PR team, the actual company PR team, not Elena's personal squad of Instagram managers, and told them to handle it however they thought was best. My phone rang at 6:30, right as I was packing up to head home. Elena. I'd been expecting this call since the Bloomberg article dropped. Honestly surprised it had taken her this long to work up the rage or the courage or whatever emotion was currently driving her. "You humiliated me," she screamed before I even got the phone fully to my ear, her voice so loud I had to hold it away from my head. "Everyone is talking about how I fired my own husband, who actually owned the company. Do you know what people are saying about me? Do you have any idea what this does to my reputation?" I sipped the coffee I'd been nursing for the past hour. It had gone cold, but was still better than the break room sludge, and waited for her to run out of steam. It took about 45 seconds. "Are you even listening to me?" she demanded. "Oh, honey," I said, and I couldn't keep the sarcasm out of my voice even if I'd wanted to, which I definitely didn't. "I heard every word. You're upset because you fired your husband without knowing he owned 71% of your family's company. You're embarrassed because it makes you look impulsive and uninformed, which, to be fair, is accurate. But here's the thing. You humiliated yourself. You wanted to be CEO so badly you didn't bother to ask questions or do basic due diligence." The desk was clean, the chairs were positioned perfectly, and the view of Chicago at night was exactly as spectacular as I remembered from all those late nights we'd spent planning this exact scenario. I stood by the window with a glass of the Pappy Van Winkle, watching the city lights stretch out toward the horizon like a field of electric stars. Somewhere out there, Victor was probably rage drinking and calling his lawyers. Bryce was updating his LinkedIn profile. Elena was planning her comeback narrative for Instagram. And I was here, in the office of the man who'd trusted me enough to hand over his life's work. This wasn't revenge, though it had felt pretty damn good watching Bryce's face when I fired him. It was restoration. Charles had built Montgomery Industries from nothing, had turned it into something that mattered, something that employed thousands of people and created value beyond just shareholder profits. The board had been slowly cannibalizing it, and he'd trusted me to stop them. I raised my glass to the city skyline and smiled, feeling the weight of responsibility and possibility settling onto my shoulders like a comfortable coat. To Monday, I whispered to the empty office, to the ghost of Charles Montgomery, to whatever came next. May it always be this fun.